The corridors of Topkapi Palace had witnessed countless stories of power, betrayal, and ambition, but none as extraordinary as that of Ibrahim Pasha. A boy who arrived in the Ottoman Empire as a slave, yet rose to become the Grand Vizier, the most powerful man after the Sultan himself. His journey was nothing short of miraculous, an outsider who not only gained the trust of Sultan Suleiman but became his closest friend, his right hand, his brother in everything but blood. Together, they carved the Ottoman Empire into a force unmatched in the world. When Suleiman ascended the throne, he found in Ibrahim a man of intellect, diplomacy, and military genius. It was not mere loyalty that bound them, it was an unbreakable brotherhood, built on years of companionship and shared victories. Unlike previous Grand Viziers who served as mere advisors, Ibrahim held an influence no one had before. He spoke freely before the Sultan, dined with him as an equal, and was granted privileges that no courtier had ever dreamed of. His rise was meteoric, his power absolute. But power in the Ottoman court was a fragile thing. The same halls that echoed with applause for Ibrahim would one day whisper against him. The same Sultan who once entrusted him with his empire would soon begin to doubt him. Was it ambition that clouded Ibrahim's judgment? Or was it the jealous scheming of those who could not bear to see a former slave hold such power? The whispers grew louder, his titles multiplied, his arrogance became evident, and his enemies became bolder. The stage was set for one of the most shocking betrayals in Ottoman history. A friendship that had once defined an era would soon come to a brutal, silent end. When Sultan Suleiman ascended the throne, he was young, ambitious, and eager to carve his name into history. But even the greatest rulers need someone they can trust, someone who understands the burdens of leadership without seeking to undermine it. Ibrahim Pasha became that man. He wasn't just an advisor, he was the backbone of Suleiman's reign, the one who turned the Sultan's vision into reality. His rise from a humble background to Grand Vizier wasn't merely a political move, it was a declaration that talent and loyalty mattered more than birthright. With Ibrahim by his side, Suleiman embarked on some of the most defining military campaigns of the Ottoman Empire. It was Ibrahim who played a crucial role in orchestrating the conquest of Rhodes in 1522, a stronghold of the Knights of St. John. He meticulously planned the siege, ensuring that Ottoman forces overwhelmed the enemy, forcing them into surrender. This victory wasn't just another addition to the empire, it sent a clear message across Europe: Suleiman's reign would not be one of complacency. Ibrahim's strategic mind was once again at work in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Ottoman forces crushed the Hungarian army in a battle that lasted barely 2 hours. This victory opened the doors to Central Europe and marked the beginning of Ottoman dominance in Hungary. The Grand Vizier was not just a war planner, he was often in the field, standing among the soldiers, earning their respect. He wasn't a mere bureaucrat, he was a warrior, a diplomat, and a statesman all in one. Beyond the battlefield, Ibrahim redefined the role of the Grand Vizier. He centralized governance, ensuring the empire ran efficiently while Suleiman focused on expansion. Trade flourished under his watch, diplomatic relations with European powers strengthened, and he even negotiated peace with France, an unprecedented move that positioned the Ottomans as a dominant force in global politics. The court had never seen a Grand Vizier with such authority. Some said he was acting as a co-ruler rather than a servant of the Sultan. But absolute power breeds enemies. His influence grew so immense that he was granted the title, Saraskar Sultan, a title dangerously close to that of the Sultan himself. He commissioned grand palaces, built monuments in his name, and made decisions without waiting for the Sultan's approval. To some, he was a man of ambition, to others, he had overstepped his bounds. The whispers in the palace grew louder: was Ibrahim still the Sultan's most trusted ally, or had he become a threat? For years, Ibrahim Pasha had been the most powerful man in the empire after Sultan Suleiman himself. He had led armies, negotiated treaties, and managed the state's affairs with an authority that few dared to question. But power is a double-edged sword. The very influence that had made him indispensable also made him dangerous. Somewhere along the way, the Grand Vizier stopped being just a trusted advisor and started to resemble a ruler in his own right. The first signs of trouble came in small ripples, subtle moments that hinted at an inevitable storm. Ibrahim had grown comfortable in his position, too comfortable. He no longer deferred to Suleiman in the way a servant should to his master. He made decisions without consulting the Sultan, believing that his judgment alone was enough. At first, Suleiman overlooked these moments. After all, this was Ibrahim, his closest friend, the man who had stood beside him from the beginning. But the empire was filled with eyes and ears, and not everyone was willing to let the Grand Vizier's unchecked power go unnoticed. One of the most dangerous signs came when Ibrahim began to use titles that suggested equality with the Sultan. The most infamous of these was Sarascar Sultan, a title unheard of for a vizier. It implied a status beyond a mere servant, hinting at shared rule rather than submission. To Suleiman's enemies at court, this was a gift. Whispers reached the Sultan. Does he still serve you, or does he serve himself? Then came the tension with Persia. Ibrahim had led the Ottoman forces against the Safavids, securing victories that should have brought him even more favor. But in his eagerness to demonstrate his own strength, he signed a peace treaty without waiting for the Sultan's approval. It was a moment of arrogance that could not be ignored. To the outside world, the Grand Vizier's name was written alongside the Sultan's as if they were equals. To Suleiman, it was a reminder that Ibrahim had begun to believe in his own invincibility. At the heart of the palace, another force was at work, Hurrem Sultan. She had risen from the ranks of the Sultan's harem to become his legal wife, breaking centuries of Ottoman tradition. Intelligent and ambitious, she understood that the empire's power structure was shifting, and she had no intention of letting Ibrahim stand in her way. Ibrahim had once been close to Hurrem, even playing a role in her securing the Sultan's favor. But over time, their interests diverged. Ibrahim supported Prince Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son and the natural heir. Hurrem, however, had her own children and saw Mustafa as a threat. Slowly, she wove a web of influence around Suleiman, feeding his growing doubts about his once-beloved Grand Vizier. As these tensions mounted, an even greater mistake sealed Ibrahim's fate: his involvement in the execution of Prince Mustafa's tutor, an act that infuriated the army and Mustafa's supporters. It was a warning sign that the Sultan's heir and his most powerful vizier were too close. For an empire built on absolute loyalty to the Sultan, this was unacceptable. Suleiman's doubts deepened, but the final decision was not made overnight. The Sultan was not a man to act on impulse. He watched, he listened, and he waited. The man who had once been his dearest friend was now an uncertainty, one that could no longer be ignored. The question was no longer if Ibrahim had to go, but when. The night was heavy with an eerie silence, the kind that comes before a storm. Within the grand halls of the Topkapi Palace, shadows stretched long under the flickering torchlight. The Sultan had made his decision. Ibrahim Pasha, the most powerful man in the empire after Suleiman himself, would not see the morning. But he didn't know it yet. Ibrahim had spent the evening in the palace, summoned by the Sultan for what seemed like an intimate discussion. It was not unusual. The two men had spent years together in deep conversation, strategy, governance, poetry, philosophy. But this night felt different. The air was heavy, the warmth of friendship absent. Perhaps, deep down, Ibrahim sensed the shift. Suleiman, however, revealed nothing. His face was unreadable, his words careful, measured. When the meeting ended, he offered Ibrahim a place to rest within the palace walls, as he had done many times before. Ibrahim accepted, unaware that he had just walked into a carefully laid trap. As the palace fell into silence, a group of executioners moved like shadows through the corridors. They were the deaf mutes, handpicked for such tasks, men who could neither hear pleas nor speak of what they had done. They slipped into Ibrahim's chamber, their presence unnoticed until it was too late. There was no trial, no grand announcement of betrayal. Only the sound of fabric rustling as the bowstring was drawn around his neck. A swift, merciless act, silent, just as the Sultan had ordered. For all his power, all his titles, Ibrahim Pasha left this world without a final word. The news did not spread immediately. The empire still slept, unaware that one of its greatest men had just been erased. But within the palace, the weight of the act was suffocating. Those closest to the Sultan dared not speak of it. Even Suleiman himself, the man who had signed the order, did not emerge from his chambers for days. By morning, the silence was replaced by murmurs. Servants exchanged uneasy glances. Courtiers walked carefully, speaking in hushed tones. When word finally reached the streets of Istanbul, it sent ripples through the empire. The man who had once been untouchable, the one who had dined at the Sultan's table as an equal, had met a fate reserved for traitors. No official reason was given. No declaration of treason, no evidence of conspiracy. His name was simply erased. Statues built in his honor were torn down. His wealth, once vast beyond imagination, was seized. In the eyes of the empire, Ibrahim Pasha had never existed. But the ghost of that night never left Suleiman. The weight of betrayal, whether real or imagined, was now his to bear. The morning after Ibrahim Pasha's execution, Topkapi Palace was quieter than it had ever been. Ministers and advisors moved with caution, afraid to utter his name too soon. The Sultan remained in seclusion, offering no explanation, no justification for his decision. But the empire could feel the shift. Something had changed, and the effects would not be immediate, but they would be lasting. For over a decade, Ibrahim Pasha had been the empire's backbone, the force that had strengthened its military, stabilized its administration, and expanded its influence beyond imagination. His absence created a void that no single man could fill. His successors, no matter how capable, would always rule under the shadow of his legacy. The first sign of trouble was in governance. Where Ibrahim had once streamlined decision-making, bureaucracy now slowed under indecisive leadership. Grand Viziers came and went, none staying long enough to match the power and stability he had commanded. Each new appointee knew that the position was no longer what it had been. They were not partners to the Sultan. They were servants, easily replaceable, easily disposable. The empire's administration became cautious, unwilling to act without absolute approval from Suleiman himself. Foreign powers, too, watched with interest. Ambassadors in Istanbul whispered among themselves, was this the beginning of instability? Was Suleiman growing paranoid? Was the once unshakable empire beginning to crack? The loss of Ibrahim Pasha meant the loss of a brilliant strategist, a diplomat who had kept tensions balanced with Europe. Now, negotiations that had once been swift turned sluggish, and rival states began to test the Ottoman borders, sensing an opening. But the most profound impact was on the Sultan himself. Though he never spoke of regret, those closest to him noticed the change. He became more withdrawn, more solemn. The man who had once shared laughter and poetry with his closest friend now carried the weight of loneliness. Some claimed that in the dead of night, he would wake in distress, haunted by memories of the man he had executed. Hurrem Sultan, the woman who had played a role in Ibrahim's downfall, remained by Suleiman's side, but even she could not fill the void left behind. The empire's balance had shifted. Where once there had been a ruler and his most trusted companion, now there was only a ruler, one who had learned that absolute power required absolute solitude. Years passed, and the empire continued to thrive, but something intangible had been lost. The golden age that Ibrahim had helped build still shone, but cracks had formed beneath its surface. Suleiman would go on to achieve great victories, to expand his dominion, but he would never again trust a man the way he had trusted Ibrahim Pasha. And so, with one silent execution, the empire had changed. Not in territory, not in wealth, but in spirit. The golden age was still alive, but the heart of it had been buried with the man who had once been its brightest star. Years after Ibrahim Pasha's execution, his name was still spoken in hushed tones within the palace. Ministers and soldiers alike remembered him as the man who had once ruled alongside the Sultan, shaping the empire with a brilliance few could match. But his fate served as a lesson, one that echoed through the halls of power for generations. The story of Ibrahim Pasha was not just one of rise and fall, it was a reminder of how fragile power could be. He had been more than a Grand Vizier, he had been a friend, a brother in arms, a trusted confidant. Yet, even that bond was not enough to protect him. In the end, loyalty in the Ottoman court was measured not by past service, but by present perception. And when that perception shifted, when whispers of arrogance and unchecked ambition reached the ears of the Sultan, even the most powerful man in the empire could be silenced overnight. Suleiman the Magnificent continued to rule for decades, expanding the empire to its greatest heights. But the absence of Ibrahim Pasha left an undeniable void. The decisions that had once been shared between two minds now rested on one. The empire remained strong, yet something had changed within its core. Trust became a dangerous luxury, and no future Grand Vizier would ever wield the same power Ibrahim once had. For those who came after, Ibrahim's fate was both a warning and a paradox. He had reached heights no former slave had ever imagined, only to fall in the most brutal of ways. Some saw his ambition as his downfall, others saw his loyalty as his greatest mistake. But history remembers him as the man who, for a time, stood at the peak of the Ottoman Empire, shaping its destiny beside one of the greatest rulers in history. And so, his story endures, a testament to the ruthless nature of power, the weight of loyalty, and the fine line between trust and betrayal.